So I read this tweet this morning from Frank Turek. How are human beings subjectively valuable if there's no God? It's just your opinion against someone else's opinion. And why should human beings flourish and not, say, roaches? These are assumptions that only make sense if someone like God exists. Two things. First of all, I think there's a typo here. I'm pretty sure what Frank Turek meant to say is, how are human beings objectively valuable if there's no God? Because subjective valuation is simply value that is relative to an individual subject, to a mind. And so that's really easy to establish insofar as any individual values something, it is subjectively valuable relative to that individual. So I'm pretty sure what he meant to say here is, how are human beings objectively valuable? The other thing I just want to note before I'm going to critique this tweet is he says these are assumptions that only make sense if someone like God exists. I'm not sure what he means by like God. I'm pretty sure what he really just means to say here is God. So uh, whether someone like someone who's whether God exists, in other words, whether a personal being who is maximally powerful, maximally good, and maximally knowing, so omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, only if a person of that description exists can human beings be objectively valuable. Pretty sure that's what he means to say in this tweet. I now want to offer a critical response to it. In my book, The Doubter's Creed, I distinguish between two different styles of apologetics. The one style is very common among conservative Christian apologists like Frank Turek, and I call it the agitation apologetic. What it seeks to do is build an apologetic bridge to the skeptic by creating agitation in them. In other words, a sense of the perceived weakness or errancy, fallibility, major metaphysical, ethical gaps, etc., within their belief system. Agitation. The other approach is what I call the agreement approach to apologetics, which seeks to do apologetics first by seeking to not create agitation, but rather to build a bridge and show where there's commonality and build from the commonality rather than discontinuity, or from the continuity rather than discontinuity. Rather than creating agitation, seek first to create a common agreement. I believe that that is the apologetic that Paul, for example, modeled, the Apostle Paul, in Acts 17 when he went to Mars Hill. And he began by reaching out to the Stoics in the audience and saying, hey, in him we live and move and have our being. We are his offspring. So building a bridge with their specifically Stoic beliefs in order then to present Christian beliefs. This tweet is classic agitation apologetics. What it does is it says that you cannot value your own child as greater than a cockroach objectively if you're not a theist in a way that is intellectually consistent. And so you should become a theist if you want to value your child as more than a cockroach. The first thing I want to say about that, something I've often said, is that I think that's just wrong. It's just flawed. So Turek wants to claim the only way to value your child as more than a cockroach objectively is if you first believe in a personal being who is maximally powerful, good, and knowledgeable, God. And even if you believe that there is some metaphysical transcendent that is required in order to value your child objectively more than a cockroach, it's not clear at all that that's what is required. For example, a person could say, why not just say all you need is objective metaphysical goodness? That you don't need a personal being that is the ground of that goodness. You could just have the goodness itself. This is not a new idea. This is an idea that goes back to Plato and the ancient Greek philosophers, so that you could say a child exemplifies goodness to a greater degree than a cockroach, maybe in virtue of having sentience, having a capacity for love, for self-awareness, a whole bunch of things. Those could all be things that elevate the human being to be objectively more valuable than a cockroach, even if you are not a theist. But there's another thing here, and another issue, which in some respects I think is even a deeper issue. The issue is going to be this. We will all find ourselves in life, in moments where we believe something is true, perhaps even contrary to evidence against its truth, or at least minimally without any ground, independent evidential ground to justify its truth. It is a properly basic thing for us. We just find ourselves drawn to it without being able to show that it is true. I mean, talking about that language of showing true, William Lane Craig, 40 years ago, in like one of the first editions of his Reasonable Faith book, made that nice, tidy distinction between the distinction of knowing something is true versus being able to show it's true. And Christians appeal to this all the time. They believe they can know God exists, for example, without being able to show that God exists. They know God is loving without being able to show God is loving. They know Jesus rose from the dead, even without being able to show that he rose from the dead. For example, you know, Grandma Smith can know Jesus rose from the dead and that he lives in her heart today and she has a personal relationship with him, even though she's not aware of any of the arguments that Gary Habermas or N.T. Wright has for the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. Christians are confident in making those kinds of appeals, the distinction between knowing something to be true and being able to show that it is true. And the point I would want to make is that you should extend that same um, grace of the distinction between knowing and showing to other people, like a person who is not a theist, who nonetheless has a deep conviction that their child is more valuable than a cockroach. Now, let me just put this in the terms of the problem of evil. Just the other day, I saw a video online of a bear, grizzly, catching salmon in a wild river up in northern British Columbia or southern Alaska. And he'd grab a fish and then he'd put his claws into it and peel back the flesh as the fish was struggling and the eye was like, and you're wondering, what does it feel like to be peeled alive and eaten alive? And that is just a drop in the bucket for the torrent of suffering in nature that we can see all around us. It could also just serve as a more general metaphor for the appearance of nature red in tooth and claw, that nature itself, the universe itself, appears to be like that grizzly in that it looks at us with cold indifference and will just peel us back and eat us alive if and when it gets the chance. A person can look at that and say, this is some significant evidence that stands against the existence of God. And I think anybody being honest about the problem of animal suffering and natural evil is going to feel the pull or the draw of that recognition that there's this strong evidence that goes against the existence of God. Some people have tried to dissolve the problem by, for example, saying, oh, maybe God's not all loving as we conceive God to be loving. Well, another option is Rene Descartes, who said, well, maybe animals don't suffer. In fact, he was quite convinced that animals don't suffer and that the screams of animals that we might hear when they are dying is, in fact, no different than the cogs and grinding gears of a machine. But that there's no sentience, no cognitive awareness, no pain experienced in nature. And the vast majority of people, I think, don't find either one of those to be remotely plausible. And so we're left with this problem of a loving God who oversees a creation, governs a creation in which grizzlies can just casually peel back the layers of a salmon as they eat it alive. And you're left wondering how do I make sense of that and believe that God exists? And then comes the course. They say, well, you can know that God exists, or certainly believe that God exists reasonably, even without being able to show that God exists, and even while recognizing that there is tension, that you don't know how to resolve this problem. And I would want to say the exact same thing for an atheist, even if they believed that they were currently dissatisfied with any ontological or metaphysical account of human value. So they don't know objectively how to explain the value of a child over that of a cockroach. But that may be no different than a Christian saying, I don't know how to explain why God allows suffering in nature. In each case, the individual can nonetheless, I believe, say, I believe God exists, even though I don't know how to explain this. I believe my child is more valuable than a cockroach, even though I don't know how to explain this. So that each one could reasonably claim to believe this thing, even when they don't know how to resolve every objection to it or every problem with it. And for the Christian who does want that grace extended to them when it comes to the problem of natural evil or divine hiddenness or any one of a number of other problems with their Christian belief, and yet they don't extend that same grace to the atheist or to someone else. They insist you have to recognize that your child is worth no more than a cockroach. But I can believe God is loving even though bears peel back salmon like they're peeling back a banana, and that's not a problem. I am reminded here of the parable of the unforgiving servant that Jesus told in Matthew 18. A man is forgiven a great sum that he owes to the king, and yet he then goes out and demands a minor sum of his neighbor. And this is a grounds for the king then to judge him as himself not extending to others the same grace that had been extended to him. And I think that goes as well when it comes to issues like in worldview and epistemology and metaphysics, that if you want a certain deference granted to you and to your belief systems where there's cognitive dissonance, where you believe you know something to be true, but you don't know how to show it as true, where you don't know how to resolve objections to it, and yet you still continue to believe in it, grant that same grace to somebody else and grant it to the person who may believe that human beings definitely are objectively more valuable than cockroaches, even though they may not know how to demonstrate that to be so within their worldview as they currently understand it. So it is simply following the golden rule when you're talking and debating with other people. And that, I think, is part of a philosophy of an apologetic of agreement. You begin by extending that same grace to others and building an agreement with them and a mutual respect with them. And I think that will be far more credible in the long term in building an apologetic for your worldview and facilitating meaningful open discussion with others than insisting that on their belief system they have no basis to believe that their beloved child is any more valuable than a cockroach.